So today we're going to look at the great Canadian literary critic Northrop Frye and his work, The Anatomy of Criticism, and doing that in order to deal with his idea of the archetype. And I'm going to speak about archetypes in a very general sense. It's not the term does not, and the concept of an archetype doesn't originate with Frye. It just becomes important in Frye's work. And so the little introduction there, by the way, I did see Frye alive at the very end of his life. He's born in 1912 and died in 1991. I saw him lecture at Western when I was there as an undergrad, just not long. It might have been the year before, in fact. And Frye is the main response to the new critics that Terry Eagleton has mentioned in his little synopsis. And we haven't actually even done the new critics on this course, I realize that. And we're not even going to do them, which is a rather extraordinary oversight in some ways, although I think in some ways the pattern or the way of reading that the new critics do, you have experienced in classrooms to some degree. You're reading a text. You're reading it as a rhetorical strategy. You're taking the text as its own, as speaking to us. You're not interested in it as a cultural artifact per se, at least not in my class. And you're not taking it as just an expression of consciousness either, or anything like that. It's not a psychological reading. Terry Eagleton says of Frye that he is even more of a formalist than the new critics are. Remember, Eagleton was critical of Northrop, or of the new critics, because they wanted to look at the text as a verbal artifact and weren't interested in context, he said. So it wasn't an expression of a culture at all. There was no historical dimension, all these things. They took it as an autonomous object and read it that way. And there's some truth in what he says, although I think he overstates it. And once again, that book that I've assigned to you by R.V. Jung, At War with the Word, is a direct response to the critics of the new critics, and he purports to defend the new critics and their approach. Frye is also criticizing the new critics, but he's coming at it from a very different angle. And I think his approach is worth looking at in and of itself, but also because I think it has to some degree been revived by our contemporary Dr. Jordan Peterson, who is reviving Carl Jung's archetypal approach to literature, at least as far as it's what he calls the collective unconscious. When I say he, Carl Jung. So he will read the Bible that way, and his lectures were wildly popular. So I thought maybe I ought to have a look at Frye again, although not many people are reading Frye now, as far as I know. And I don't know how even influential he is in literary circles anymore. But at one point, he was the main response to the new critics before the 1960s and the post-structuralist and all that sort of thing, literary theory, came on the scenes. But in the 1950s and 60s, Frye is the main respondent to the new critics. And as Eagleton says, at least the new critic, and he's critical of Frye on this, he says at least the new critic allowed that literature was in some sense a cognitive thing. It involved you're knowing something. There's an element of knowledge of the world, whereas Frye isn't even interested in that. He talks about literature as again an expression of the collective unconscious. So it's almost, there's no application to the world at all. And of course this drives Eagleton crazy because he's a Marxist and he reads literature as an ideological thing. So it's only that. And Frye's approach excludes that, even that possibility, so it drives Eagleton crazy. But that's not why I'm looking at him, just because I don't agree with Eagleton's approach. It's because I actually think there's something interesting about his approach, and it probably is conducive to what I would regard as a helpful way of looking at literary criticism and literary theory. And we haven't really got into it that much. Even last semester, not too much. But it does arise in the 20th century, this idea of archetypes, and it comes in various forms. So I'm going to look at that in a general way, and I'm going to talk about how it arises in, say, anthropology. I talked last class about structuralism and Claude Lévi-Strauss and his cultural anthropology and so forth. I'm going to talk about another anthropologist today, whom I've mentioned in other classes, James Fraser, the Golden Bough. He also looks at things archetypally, but in terms of myths. But let's talk about the word archetype to begin with. An archetype is just it's two words. It's a Greek word. Two Greek words, actually. Arche and type. Arche is an origin or a beginning. In this case, it's an original pattern or a template from which copies are made. And the most essential features of subsequent copies are to be found in that original archetype. As far as literature goes, there are all different types of archetypes or classes of archetypes. And it can be any idea or character or action or object or event or even a setting that has the essential characteristics of the original thing. And so we're going to contrast it now in the late 18th century, or is it early 19th? Friedrich Schiller talks about, he writes on the naive and sentimental in poetry. This is Schiller. One of the, along with Goethe, one of the classical figures of German classicism. And what I think Schiller is laying down is to some degree the archetypal versus the applied. So the naive is primitive, and it's general and it's universal. So the Greek era would have been naive in this sense. It would have been primitive, and it would have been general, and it would have been universal. So this is why his explanation for why Greek literature remains so profound is because it's in that sense archetypal. I'm putting words into his mouth. He doesn't say this, but I'm reading into it. But he's arguing for that, whereas we live in a sentimental age. It's derivative. We live in a very sophisticated age. There's a great deal of complexity and specialization and so forth. And now we have unique things, and we also have particular things, but they all relate back to the naive. So this is, again, remember Schiller is the classicist here, and he's emphasizing very strongly the importance of Greek art and Greek writing. German classicism is marked by this hearkening back to Greek literature, and you can find it also in the early speculations on the greatness of the Hebrew scriptures as well, which is likewise because it is primitive and it is general and it's universal, which is why the Oxford professor of poetry, who translated Greek into the Hebrew scriptures into English, talked about it being fundamentally sublime. It was natural, and and he said that Greek poetry didn't have the features, or Greek Hebrew poetry didn't have the features of other poetry. It was more like it was more like feeling. It was fundamentally expressive, and so it translated well into every language. So when people read the Psalms, whatever translation they read it in, he said it retains something of its power because of its proximity with what Schiller calls this naive quality, but we could say it's more primitive, it's more general, and it's more universal, so it applies in every context. So it translates into the vernacular, which are specialized, sophisticated, and unique tongues, and yet it retains something of that. And so he said that Hebrew poetry is not correct, by the way, that Hebrew poetry doesn't have any of the literary features that we note of neoclassical poetics. And to some extent he's correct, but he's not right that there are no features to it. So parallelism is the primary feature of Hebrew poetry, and repetition, and figures of repetition. Whereas Greco-Roman poetry is a little different. It doesn't have meter, right? Hebrew poetry doesn't work on a metrical pattern. It doesn't use rhyme, but it does use figures of speech. It uses tropes and schemes and so forth. Those things are there, and the parallelism is the favored pattern. But that's more or less it. But in poetry, the archetypal is what Schiller calls the naive. This is my suggestion here. And so it's talking about primitive things. And you remember last semester, I talked about this alleged Celtic bard Ossian, who found Gaelic poetry written by this bard and then translated it into English, and everyone around the continent was raving about the sublimity of the great Ossian. And the reason they thought he was great is because he was a primitive, and what he said was generally applicable irrespective of the translation, and it was universal in fact, and that was the best poetry. And so also Native American cultures were likewise primitive, but primitive meant good now. It wasn't bad, it was good. And this was characteristic of the Romantic era. They want to get back to origins, because the origins were thought to be more closely rooted in a general reality. And I think this marks Wordsworth's own poetic project, for instance. So when he's talking about getting back to nature, he doesn't mean it in the vulgar sense of the empirical world. It's quite obvious he means something deeper than that, more archetypal than that. So this is not when Frye comes to write his critical work, he first writes a book on William Blake. So he's a romanticist himself, and he's interested in the deep roots of all art. And so he even writes 3 books on the Bible, for that matter, does Northrop Frye. He lectured on it for years at University of Toronto. And one of those books is called The Great Code, which he gets from William Blake, because William Blake called the Bible the Great Code of all literature. But by Great Code, he means the archetype. So if you want to understand literature or culture or anything for that matter, it is most deeply rooted in the primal, universal, general expressions of Scripture. That's the way Frye approached the Bible. Very interesting. And our contemporary Jordan Peterson is doing the same sort of thing, but he's trying to explain it more psychologically, like Jung. Whereas Frye is more interested in the literary features of it. Well, I'm going to come to that in a minute. But there are different types of archetypes. So let's deal archetypal subjects. What are archetypal subjects? Well, free will versus destiny. The one that obsesses philosophy departments and Christians. And which battles are raged over who's a Christian, who isn't a Christian. Well, this is a pattern of dispute that's an archetypal one, actually. And it's not just in theological circles, it's in all circles. Did you have a choice in this, or are you destined to do it? It's to some degree, if you look at the story of Oedipus the king, he thinks he's following his free will. And in fact, he's fated to do this. So which one is it? Well, there's a conflict that's irresolvable there in it. But this is an archetypal subject. so is the appearance of something versus the reality of it. Right? It appears this way, but what is the reality of it? I mean, that theme you can find in Plato even. That's an archetypal subject. The relationship between an individual and his or her society, that's an archetypal subject. Are we really individuals? Are we products of our culture? Where does that balance lie? But it is a tension. Then there are archetypal themes. The rivalry between brothers, Joseph and his brothers, or Jacob and Esau. It's not played up much, but Jesus and his brothers. Cain and Abel. The longing for a father throughout Western literature, going back to maybe even the Odyssey. You find it all over the place. The country bumpkin coming into the city for the first time. It's an archetypal theme. And finding it a place of great depravity and yet huge intrigue. A great desire for the city, which at the same time is hugely complex and dangerous. So that's an archetypal theme, I think. The relationship and the tension between different generations, so between parents and children, that's an archetypal theme. Parents wanting to look after their children, to do what's best for them, children wanting to break away from their parents, that tension. It's a biblical theme, it's a literary theme, it's ubiquitous. There are certain archetypal characters. The fool, the hero, the rebel, the temptress, the damsel in distress, the witch, the huckster who's going to cheat you, or a devil even, as the tempter. There are even certain archetypal images like of animals and birds and natural phenomena. So you think about a lion, it's an archetypal image. It's not just a creature. Same with an eagle. I mean, so much so that in the book of Revelation it can lean upon those. An ox as a figure of natural strength. Right? Those are archetypal images. Archetypal subjects. Birth. Love, guilt, redemption, death, war. Like those are everything that I just said. They are primitive, so they're really basic. They are general and they are also universal, so you can play on those. With those different types of archetypes, and there's a wide variety there, with those played out, you can see that literature, even if you identify all of those that I just said, and there are more than that, the king and things like the unjust steward in Scripture, right? So a king, a bad king, or rebellious people. There's a good king and there are bad people. Those are also archetypal situations, right? So you can, when you read a story and you've had enough experience in life, you can immediately situate yourself in that story and you can identify with it, and you're moved by the characters, and you immediately gravitate towards certain figures because you recognize the pattern. Disney works on this template, right? Children's stories are almost always archetypal. They deal with not obscure, not unique individuals. They're not unique individuals are not interesting individuals, by the way. They're simply not, because you can't identify with them. You're not interested in them. So you don't want to be unique. You don't want to be original. So the romantic cult of originality has led to literature being, ironically, totally insignificant. If you're going to have an orphan as your hero, he's only interesting because he is a hero, not because he's an orphan. Or if he is because he's an orphan, then it's because he's the underdog, and you're on side with. And we recognize underdogs and oppressed individuals, so we identify with that in that sense. So these are all different types of archetypes, and I think they go back, and they are throughout literature. So that's why I say that a study of Frye's look at literature in terms of archetypes is interesting, and we haven't really touched on it too much on this course, but I think there is something there, and it's something that I do think that the Bible speaks to in a profound way. And people, when they read the Bible, and when Jesus tells his own stories, for instance, he really does lean on archetypal stories. So there was a farmer, right? And he had farm hands, or he sowed crops, and immediately those stories. But then there are different types or movements in archetypes, largely in the 20th century. And then I'm going to move towards Frye here. One is that in anthropology. And the relation of myths to rituals. So last time I talked about Claude Lévi-Strauss. And he's going to look at certain myths and the rituals that people perform. Remember we talked about the Anzade natives, the Indians, and they perform certain rituals in order to sow their crops and to have productive farmland, and they would commit. So the rituals fit in with their myths. So what's the difference between a myth and a ritual? Well, myth is a story about supernatural beings, roughly speaking. Sometimes it has humans, but the humans then have supernatural powers. So think of Odysseus. He's a demigod. And to some degree, the modern superheroes sort of latch hold of that, onto that idea of a godlike powers. So it's almost a mythic account in a contemporary setting. And the supernatural powers of the characters, if they are human, allow them to interact with these divine beings and are of interest to the divine beings. So if you're Odysseus, the gods are very interested in who you are. And it's not just because your mother's divine and your father, so you're semi-divine yourself. There seems to be more than that. He is godlike Odysseus or godlike Achilles, and the gods are very interested in him. But rituals are ceremonials that reenact some sort of sacred myth. And one of the debates within anthropology is whether the ritual gives rise to the myth or the myth gives rise to the ritual. Which came first? So the one that is most interesting to me, or at least has been, is that of the Cambridge school, so-called, of anthropology. And again, this man, Sir James Fraser. He's not the only one, but Sir James Fraser, and his work, The Golden Bough. And I've never read the entirety of it because it really is thousands and thousands of pages. I have the abbreviated version, and I think it's 1,000. And what he does in The Golden Bough is he collects, and he and his whole circle of Cambridge anthropologists, and they're doing comparative anthropology. So they go around the world, they look at different cultures, and they collect their myths. And when they collect them, they compare and contrast them, and they note primarily the fundamental similarities. And so The Golden Bough is precisely this. And the Golden Bough there being taken from Virgil's Aeneid, by the way. So it's what Aeneas reaches up to pluck in order to go down into the underworld. Remember, Aeneas is allowed to go down, but in order to get access to the underworld where he needs to go to find how to get back home, he has to get down there, and Chiron has to give him passage. So when Chiron challenges you as a mortal, saying you're not dead yet, you can't come down here, you show him the Golden Bough and he will let you go through, and that will show him that you've been sent by the gods. And only if you've been sent by the gods will you be able to get that Golden Bough. It will fall into your hand without any effort. It will come off in your hand, and that will show him that the gods have sent you, so it's predestined, in other words. But it's only when you choose to undertake this that you show your heroism. Now, interestingly, in that passage, by the way, he reaches up, it doesn't fall into his hands. He rips it off. So this is the Romans, right? So yes, things are fated, but and guess what? It's not going to fall to you. You're going to have to tear it and bring it and conform it to your will. So he does that. He goes down at any rate. That's the myth from the Golden Bough. Now, Fraser looks at myths in Africa, in North America, in South America, Latin America, Asia, Europe, and so forth, and traces certain common myths about sacred trees and so forth, and a common mythology there. And these are really so there's a pattern like the quest for the Holy Grail will be seen as a mythological quest, which will be those of Fraser's circle. I think it's J.L. Weston, says that the quest for the Holy Grail can be traced back to Christian legend, and this goes back to ancient Greek fertility practices, which themselves go back to an Indo-European myth about Hindu fertility practices and so forth. So there's a myth behind the myth behind the myth, but they're all sort of fundamentally rooted. Anyway, whatever you make of that. But they're all talking about some fundamental archetypal experience, and all cultures have similar sorts of stories. I find it really interesting, at least as a theory. So there are regular standard patterns, and it seems to me that Jordan Peterson's made a career out of this. So he'll interpret the Disney stories and other cultural things in accordance with that. So now he does it as a psychologist in the Carl Jung school, but he's really reading it as he's looking at the literature as a repository of the collective unconscious. So that's the first movement. It's the anthropology. Let me talk about psychology now and Carl Jung. I don't know if did we do Jung here in psychology at Tyndale? I don't know if anybody has any interest anymore. It's sort of fallen out of favor in the field of psychology. For me, it's one of the more interesting realms. And really, Jung is a sort of is writing and thinking in response to Sigmund Freud. And Freud's theory of the unconscious. So remember, you don't know, maybe. Freud has this theory that the unconscious is what explains why we do bizarre things and why we are motivated to do things that are against our own self-interest, often. Or it explains addictions, it explains our passions, it explains why we're great artists. There's an unconscious there that's driving that. Jung thinks that this is too simplistic and thinks that there has to be something even more general uniting this. And so rather than just the unconscious, it's the collective unconscious. So it's a shared drive or desire. And he finds it primarily evidenced in literature and in religion, just like Peterson. So it's not the personal unconsciousness is Freud, the collective is Jung. And those will be presented in the archetypes then. More or less clear? So you can see how it would fit with a literary approach, a different way of looking at literature that you will will be in some ways an antidote or an alternative at any rate to contemporary postmodern literary theories, which don't seem to be trying to explain anything. They're trying to be to tear things apart. And so this is I would regard this as a humanistic theory of literature still, in the sense that it applies to all humanity. Right? And the new critics likewise. There's a text, the text comprehensible, and the text speaks to each of us, and it doesn't matter if I'm a female reader, a male reader, a white reader, a black reader, or whatever reader. Those things are not relevant. The text speaks to me, and it speaks to me because I'm a human being, and my humanity I share with everybody else who's a reader. They're not interested in the identity groups and all the cultural distinctives that will break down the particularities of what would be called the sentimental culture. The uniqueness. We're not interested in uniqueness. Insofar as it's literature, it's general and archetypal and primitive. It speaks to all human beings, which is why we like it and we pass it on to others. Okay, so now let's talk specifically about Northrop Frye. So Freud and Jung is the most important figure for Frye, I think. But I don't think it's fair to call Frye a Jungian. And he certainly didn't think so, although he was accused of being a Jungian. And one of the funny things about Frye, if you ever watch him, and there are, so he's sufficiently close to us in time that you can find videos of him being interviewed usually on the CBC or something like that, on the work of the educated imagination or something. Frye comes up with this theory of archetypes, but it's only one of 4 approaches. So let me talk about that here, and then we'll come to the text that you've had a snippet of. So there are 4 types. So he begins with this work on Blake, Fearful Symmetry. And he reads Blake in more or less the terms that I've just discussed. But then he comes up with an Anatomy of Criticism. This is 1957. And this is the work we're interested in here. 1957. Anatomy of Criticism. Well, in anatomy, he's going to take it apart. He doesn't just give us archetypes. Then it would be an archetypal theory of criticism. Archetypal theory is only one approach, and he gives us 4. So one of the approaches is the historical approach. And that will give us a theory of modes of literature, as he calls them. So there's a fictional mode. There's a tragic mode, a comic mode, a thematic mode. All those fit under a historical type of criticism. So he identifies that. And by the way, the Anatomy of Criticism is broken into 4. Secondly, he talks about an ethical type of criticism. And these relate to symbols. And these will be the best way I'm not sure I can't recall now, but it almost sounds like he's doing what Dante does when he talks about fourfold allegory, because he talks about a literal and descriptive way of looking at it, a formal, a mythical, and an anagogical. He even uses the word anagogical, which Dante does as well. So this is a symbolic way, or an allegorical. He doesn't want to use the word allegory, but it is to some degree that way, of that sort. And again, maybe I should write these down on the board behind me. So the historical, the symbolic. Thirdly, he will talk about the archetypal now. I'll break these down in a second. And then finally, he will talk about rhetorical criticism. And rhetorical criticism is what the new critics do. But back again, the ethical criticism, what did I put? Symbolic. It's not symbolic, it's ethical. But it looks at symbolic symbols. Sorry. So it's the theory of symbols. Well, what's the theory? You can look at it along the lines of Dante's fourfold allegory. This is a rich way of looking at it. The archetypal is a theory of myths, and he fits these with the seasons. So he explains it in terms of, so the spring as a season, he connects with comedy. He connects the summer with romance as a genre. He connects the autumn with tragedy. And he connects the winter with irony and satire. Why ironic? Because everything seems dead. And yet, life is coming again. So it seems fixed, it's frozen, it's like the witch, the white witch. It's ever going to be winter, there's never going to be a turn, but the satire is that there is no possibility of things remaining as they are forever, it's going to break up. So satire falls within that. So he makes it more of almost a nature mythology type thing. And so he breaks Shakespeare, and he notes in Shakespeare's tragedies lots of references to autumnal type scenes, dark signs of fall, like the leaves falling, this sort of thing. And he notes in his comedies, it's often early spring. They're going around the maypole. There's fertility. There's marriages in it and that sort of thing, right? So all of those sorts of associations. Finally, in the rhetorical criticism, there is where he is critiquing genres. And that's the stuff we would have seen in neoclassical and even classical literary theory. So this is more the traditional, the rhetorical one. So it's looking at things in terms of genres. And it's the way I've taught the course here at Tyndale, by and large, is I've largely appealed to these things in the classical sense. But I do think there is something about these other ways of looking at it. And I think it's helpful in that sense. The criticisms of it are basically that it's overly simplistic. And it sees everything in general, but it doesn't actually look at things very specifically. It doesn't read works, it sees works and puts them into these big patterns all the time. I think it seems reasonably accurate criticism. All the same, that's what you do when you think about things. You put them in general. That's how you understand things. Does it fit a pattern? And if it does, then it seems to be more meaningful. Anyway, what he's doing here, to some degree, is what has been done throughout the history of reflection on literature, though, as well. So, did I mention this last semester? I can't remember. There's in the 4th century, there's a figure, a Greek mythographer called Euhemerus, who sort of contemporary with Plato, Socrates, who explains that the Greek gods were actually historical figures that myths arose out of. So historical events, historical figures that attained a sort of a divine status in the story. So that's where. So he's actually deconstructing, we would probably use that phrase now, the myths of the ancient Greeks. So it's Euhemerism. It's the history theory of mythology. Mythology originates from historical events. By the way, the church fathers this was one of their favored strategies for explaining pagan mythology. So the myths, the gods that you say are gods, these are actually just human figures that you've created into gods. They're not real gods. The men that you worship as gods were men. Whereas now we're presenting with you the one true God. That sort of strategy. But note that it's doing something with mythology then. It's reducing it to a historical event. Whereas literature, as the category of writing, seems to be doing something more primal than that. Anyway, comments or questions or observations, or do you find this interesting, helpful? I think it's interesting. And whether it's helpful, we'll see. We'll see when you go to apply it. But I do think that there's something to be said about Frye's approach. And where our extract here, the Archetypes of Literature, is really laying hold on what I've just said in that sort of summary statement there. So I'll read a bit from Frye and then we'll comment on them as well. So he begins with, and this is, he's giving a summary of his views on literature. That's what we have here. So it's published in My Credo, the Archetypes of Literature. So every organized body of knowledge can be learned progressively. And experience shows that there is also something progressive about the learning of literature. Our opening sentence has already got us into a semantic difficulty. Physics is an organized body of knowledge about nature, and a student of it says that he's learning physics, not that he's learning nature. Art, like nature, is the subject of a systematic study and has to be distinguished from the study itself, which is criticism. It is therefore impossible to learn literature. One learns about it in a certain way, but what one learns transitively is the criticism of literature. So when you study literature, you're actually studying literary criticism, which is why Frye argues that literary criticism is unavoidable. Like when you're actually studying it, you can read it, but as soon as you're studying it, you're actually you're reading about how you read. That's so that when you study literature, you're not only reading the original works, you're actually thinking about what you do when you read those works. So similarly, the difficulty often felt in teaching literature arises from the fact that it cannot be done. The criticism of literature is all that can be directly taught. So, while no one expects literature itself to behave like a science, there is surely no reason why criticism, as a systematic and organized study, should not be at least partly a science. And by the way, this is what Frye was trying to do with the anatomy of criticism, is he was trying to present the study of literature as a legitimate university discipline. Remember when it arose, and Eagleton talked about this, it had a credibility gap. It was a new field of study. It was talking about the language in which we write. It was the vernacular. It wasn't dealing with literature even in an ancient sense. There was no difficulty with it. You could pick it up and read it. So it seemed like everybody can study literature. Well, Frye's response is we actually never do study literature. We study literary criticism. And that itself is a science. So it has then an objectivity to it. And it has a legitimacy, and it is a sort of type of knowledge then. And then he's going to break down the different ways of looking at it. So Frye is, to some degree, doing what the early English scholars were seeking to do, which is to establish the study of literature as a legitimate, worthy discipline within the academy. And at that point, up to that point, it had been in question. And he's going to give it not only its traditional rhetorical approach, he's going to give it far greater purchase. So he says, it's not a pure or exact science, perhaps, but these phrases form part of a 19th century cosmology which is no longer with us. So when you talk about scientists and the scientists say they do science, what the heck does that mean? I do knowledge. Science means knowledge. I mean, I'm doing knowledge. Oh, are you? Okay. You wear a white lab coat and there you're doing knowledge? I point out to the scientist that that's what he's saying. I'm doing knowledge. Oh, are you? That's interesting. But he says, so criticism deals with the arts and may well be something of an art itself. But it does not follow that it must be unsystematic. If it is to be related to the sciences, too, it does not follow that it must be deprived of the graces of culture. So now that's very interesting. Because what he is doing here, and I've addressed this in my C.S. Lewis course, is dealing with the problem of the abolition of man and the destruction of the quadrivium in modernity, right? The discarded image is really the destruction of the quadrivium. Geometry will not be done the same way. Arithmetic will not be done the same way. Numbers haven't changed, but the arithmetic, the way like calculus and so forth, is a new one. We'll move away from Euclid's notion of geometry. Astronomy has been exploded. Nobody believes in the Ptolemaic cosmology anymore, right? And music moves away from just seeking to repeat or imitate the eternal musical spheres, and it starts to take on a richness and a complexity, and there's an interaction with it, and your different polyphonies and so forth. So music starts to evolve. But those are all the destruction of the quadrivium. And what's left is the trivium then, the language arts. Are they sciences at all then? If what was held to be the science of number, which is the quadrivium, is no longer accurate, then why should the sciences of words be accurate? So it falls into disrepute. So it tries to ape the methodology of the sciences. Right? So we're going to use the experimental method and whatever. But Frye says that there are distinctive features of literary study that are cultural and need to be held on as such. So it's not just a science like all the others, let alone a lesser science. Certainly criticism, as we find it in the learned journals and scholarly monographs, has every characteristic of a science. Evidence is examined scientifically. Previous authority, by the way, he's writing before postmodern literary criticism theory, because everything that he says is true of learned journals and scholarly monographs is no longer true. But he was talking before the decline of postmodern literary theories. So evidence is examined scientifically, not ideologically. Texts are edited scientifically. Well, nobody edits texts anymore. Prosody is scientific in structure. So is phonetics, so is philology. And yet, in studying this kind of critical science, the student becomes aware of a centrifugal movement. What's a centrifugal movement? You remember that from physics? Like when you spin around, if you're on one of those, what are those things? The merry-go-round where you wheel it around and you go around, and what do you feel yourself falling out? That's the centrifugal force. It's the faster it goes around, the harder it is to hold on. You're getting thrown off the thing. That's the centrifugal force. He says, in studying this kind of critical science, the student becomes aware of a centrifugal movement carrying him away from literature. He finds that literature is the central division of the humanities, flanked on one side by history and on the other by philosophy. Who does he sound like here? He sounds like Sir Philip Sidney. Right? And literature is the central discipline there. The historical aspect, the philosophical. Criticism so far ranks only as a subdivision of literature, and hence, for the systematic mental organization of the subject, the student has to turn to the conceptual framework of the historian for events and to that of the philosopher for ideas. Even the more centrally placed critical sciences, such as textual editing, seem to be part of a background that recedes into history or some other non-literary field. The thought suggests itself that the ancillary critical disciplines may be related to a central expanding pattern of systematic comprehension which has not yet been established, but which, if it were established, would prevent them from becoming centrifugal. If such a pattern exists, then criticism would be to art what philosophy is to wisdom and history to action. So far he's laying it out, and I would say his approach is not my approach. I don't think that the study of literature is only the study of literary criticism. I do think if I want to understand literature, I do have to lean upon the historians to some degree, and I do have to lean on the philosophers for ideas. And it's not a self-contained thing which he seems to present it as. And I would have thought that in terms of a not just the way we do things here at Tyndale, but the way that would be done almost in any university, including Frye's, would be to give literature a certain function. It might be the function of rhetoric. So it's a central application of an appreciation of the beautiful, or the goodness and the true in the beautiful. But it doesn't stand on its own, and it needs to lean on history and lean on philosophy. But anyway, I'll skip over that there and go to part 2. The unity of a work of art, the basis of structural analysis, has not been produced solely by the unconditioned will of the artist. For the artist is only efficient, is only its efficient cause. It has form, and consequently a formal cause. The fact that revision is possible, that the poet makes changes, not because he likes them better, but because they are better, means that poems, like poets, are born and not made. The poet's task is to deliver the... Note that in all of these observations, he's leaning on the sort of vocabulary and intellectual framework that the classical writers were. This is why I like Frye. I think he is not trying to be novel in the sense of unique. He's trying to capture the essence of the thing. He's trying, as a thinker, to do what he claims archetypes do. That is, to be primitive and general and universal. So he, by doing that, is engaging with the same vocabulary and ideas that previous critics had, whom he also has read. The poet's task is to deliver the poem in as uninjured a state as possible. And if the poem is alive, it is equally anxious to be rid of him, and screams to be cut loose from his private memories and associations, his desire for self-expression, and all the other navel strings and feeding tubes of his ego. So he's opposing this to the romantic view of poetry. It's an expression of his psychology. So he's disputing that. And a good poem doesn't need to understand what Mr. Keats had for breakfast before reading the poem. It stands on its own. It speaks to us or it does not. You don't need to read extensively into the background of the writer in order to have the poem to work upon us. That's his point here. The critic takes over where the poet leaves off. And criticism can hardly do without a kind of literary psychology connecting the poet with the poem. Part of this may be a psychological study of the poet, though this is useful chiefly in analyzing the failures in his expression, the things in him which are still attached to his work. More important is the fact that every poet has his private mythology, his own spectroscopic band or peculiar formation of symbols, of much of which he is quite unconscious. In works with characters of their own, such as dramas and novels, the same psychological analysis may be extended to the interplay of characters, though of course literary psychology would analyze the behavior of such characters only in relation to literary conventions. So note that he's talking about causes now, and he's using Aristotelian language, and I think that's interesting and helpful again. And he's not only talking about what I said most criticism reduces itself to, which is just the formal cause. It ignores the efficient cause. It ignores the final cause. It just looks at the formal and the, what do we call it? Instrumental cause. Just looks at the text. And it will do it whether it wants to look at it as a psychological artifact or whether it wants to look at it as a cultural artifact. Whereas Frye wants to connect it with what drives the poet to begin with, and what drives the poet, and this is where I think he's helpful, is the archetype. It's the general collective unconsciousness that drives the poet even. So he's not a unique individual. He's not a representative of his cultural group. It's the universal human drives that also drive the poet. If he is a poet, and he's not just a bad writer. So there is still before us the problem of the formal cause of the poem. A problem deeply involved with the question of genre, which is the rhetorical criticism. We cannot say much about genre, for criticism does not know much about them. A good many critical efforts to grapple with such words as novel or epic are chiefly interesting as examples of the psychology of rumor. Two conceptions of the genre, however, are obviously fallacious, and as they are opposite extremes, the truth must lie somewhere between them. One is the pseudo-Platonic conception of genres as existing prior to and independently of creation, like of ideas, like they're in the think of the form and the particular. So there's an epic, there's an idea of an epic, and these are the specific application or the particular application. So that's one fallacious view of it, which confuses them with mere conventions of form like the sonnet. The other is that pseudo-biological conception of them as evolving species, which turns up in so many surveys of the development of this or that form. So, for example, let's take the epic. One of the ways in which you could, if you've done first year with me, which most of you have, I think, when I did the epic, I started with the Odyssey, and then we moved on to the Aeneid, and then we moved on to Dante and his Commedia, and then we went to Milton, and if you've done the Romantic epic, we trace it in there. So you could just talk about this as an evolution of the form and not make any value judgment on it and say it's not superior, it's just it evolves over time, and now the epic is this. And if you did that, then you would regard the original epics as substandard and the later epics as superior. And that would be a pseudo-biological sense of them as an evolving species. On the other hand, this is just illustrating what he says, if you thought that the epic was a fixed thing, a form, and the writers were simply approximating them, then you would probably regard the Homer's epic as the only, as the best epic, and the others really as always lesser epics. And I'm not sure that that's legitimate either. In fact, I don't think it is legitimate. And that's where T.S. Eliot comes in, tradition and the individual talent, right? So it's an ongoing dialogue, and the artist, as he continues to write, is engaging with that tradition, and he himself is speaking from that tradition, and the tradition to some extent is speaking through him. But that doesn't mean he's superior to it, or that it is superior to him, but he is in a sort of a... I think that's what Frye's talking about here. I think he's agreeing with Eliot on that. Clear? No? Right. Okay. We next inquire for the origin of the genre and turn first of all to the social conditions and cultural demands which produce it. In other words, to the material cause of the work of art. This leads us into literary history, which differs from ordinary history in that in its containing categories. So what are these categories? Gothic, Baroque, Romantic, and the like are cultural categories of little use to the ordinary historian, but of great use to the literary historian. Most literary history does not get as far as these categories, but even so, we know more about it than most kinds of critical scholarship. The historian treats literature and philosophy historically. The Marxist treats everything materially. He doesn't say that, right? It subsumes everything that it sees and takes it as a species of that. So the historian treats literature as a historical artifact, and it treats philosophy as a historical artifact. It drives the people in literature crazy, and it drives people in philosophy crazy. And the so-called history of ideas approach marks the beginning of an attempt to treat history and philosophy from the point of view of autonomous criticism. But still we feel that there's something missing. We say that every poet has his own peculiar formation of images. But when so many poets use so many of the same images, surely there are much bigger critical problems involved than biographical ones. As Mr. Auden's brilliant essay, The Enchafed Flood, shows, an important symbol like the sea cannot remain within the poetry of Shelley or Keats or Coleridge. It is bound to expand over many poets into an archetypal symbol of literature. So now he's moving to solve the problem that he's just delineated. We need this archetypal sense. If the genre has a historical origin, why does the genre of drama emerge from medieval religion in a way so strikingly similar to the way it emerged from Greek religion centuries before? So look at when he's talking about drama here, he could be talking about comedy or tragedy. Then look at medieval drama or medieval Renaissance drama. Look at Shakespeare. Why is Shakespeare's comedy and Shakespeare's tragedy so Christian? Why is Greek drama and Greek comedy and Greek tragedy so much tied in with Greek religious practices? This is a problem of structure rather than origin, and suggests that there may be archetypes of genres as well as of images. Remember, I talked about different types of archetypes. So there could be archetypes of genres as well. It is clear that criticism cannot be systematic unless there's a quality in literature which enables it to be so, an order of words corresponding to the order of nature in the natural sciences. An archetype should be not only a unifying category of criticism, but itself a part of a total form. And it leads us at once to the question of what sort of total form criticism can see in literature. Our survey of critical techniques has taken us as far as literary history. Total literary history moves from the primitive to the sophisticated. This is the naive to the sentimental that I talk about. So the primitive to the sophisticated. And here we glimpse the possibility of seeing literature as a complication of a relatively restricted and simple group of formulae that can be studied in primitive culture. If so, then the search for archetypes is a kind of literary anthropology. Now that's interesting. So rather than anthropology, it's a literary anthropology of sorts, concerned with the way that literature is informed by pre-literary categories such as ritual, myth, and folktale. We next realize that the relation between these categories in literature... Could I stop just before you go out, Diana? As far as because we got reading week, I talked about the assignment. So you can do a book study, as I say. You can do a study, or I'm going to put up essay questions as possibilities, if you'd rather not do that. Or you can do a third thing, which is to take one of the chapters and engage with that and do a critical engagement with one of the chapters from R.V. Young's At War with the Word. Just thinking about it, because each chapter is sufficiently dense on its own that you really, I mean, it's meaty stuff, right? And he's so you can try that. Okay, so just I wanted to say that while you're still here. Okay. So once we acknowledge that literature is informed by pre-literary categories, such as ritual, myth, and folktale. So he doesn't take myths as literature, and he doesn't take folktales as literature, and he doesn't take rituals as literature. These are the sort of the material for literature. We next realize that the relation between these categories and literature is by no means purely one of descent. So it's not just loss. Like the original myths were more primal, more general, but it's not only one of descent, as we find them reappearing in the greatest classics. In fact, there seems to be a general tendency on the part of great classics to revert to them, which is why we consider them to be so great, because it talks about primal human struggles, which the myths will also replicate. This coincides with the feeling that we have all had, that the study of mediocre works of art, however energetic, obstinately remains a random and peripheral form of critical experience, whereas the profound masterpiece seems to draw us to a point at which we can see an enormous number of converging patterns of significance. So in Tolstoy's work, what was the little work that I do in first year now? The Death of Ivan Ilyich. I mean, he's talking about Ivan Ilyich, but he's really talking about every man. He's talking about death, but he's talking about the desire to avoid death, and even to consider the possibility that death is something that we can experience. Well, is this not a ubiquitous archetypal theme to the response to? So death is an archetypal experience, there's no doubt about it, but the desire to avoid it and to even consider it and to flee it at all costs, we can see go back in Oedipus and so forth. So why is this such a good work? Well, it's well written. And it talks about his sickness then, and then it starts to telescope. So the early chapter is long and they get progressively shorter as time goes by. So time starts to get condensed. There are 40 years of his life that are told in one chapter. And then it condenses, and in the end, he's dealing with a few days. Right? So time starts to get shorter as the end of his life gets shorter. Well, this is terrifically done. Right? That sense that the death is coming, and it's coming very quickly, and it's chasing him and coming up on him. So that the way in which it's told is terrific, but it's the archetypal themes that make it a great work of literature, not just the way it's told anyway. It's just a thought. And so, but that's what makes it a profound masterpiece. We can see an enormous number of converging patterns of significance. And here we begin to wonder if we cannot see literature not only as complicating itself in time, but as spread out in conceptual space from some unseen center. This is why I think there's something to Frye. This inductive movement towards the archetype is a process of backing up, as it were, from structural analysis. As we back up from a painting if we want to see composition instead of brushwork. So go to the AGO, look at a painting. You can look at it this close and you can notice the intricate brushwork. But if you really want to see the whole picture, particularly if it's a big picture, you got to stand way back and you get the big picture then. So archetypes require us to stand back and look at it from broad. So in the foreground of the gravedigger scene in Hamlet, for instance, is an intricate verbal texture ranging from the puns of the first clown to the danse macabre of the Yorick soliloquy, which we study in the printed text. One step back, and we are in the Wilson, Knight, and Spurgeon group of critics. Well, these are the ones that read it as a study of psychology and imagery and symbolism. So Wilson Knight's a Freudian critic. Listening to the steady rain of images of corruption and decay, here too, as the sense of the place of this scene in the whole play, so it's Act 5, Scene 1, begins to dawn on us, we are on the network of psychological relationships which were the main interests of A.C. Bradley when he studied Hamlet. But after all, we say we are forgetting the genre. Hamlet is a play and an Elizabethan play. So we take another step back into the Stoll and Shaw group, George Bernard Shaw and E.E. Stoll, that are focused on the relationship of Shakespeare's play to the dramatic conventions of the Elizabethan and Jacobean ages. So that's another step back. One step more, and we can begin to glimpse the archetype of the scene, of the hero's Liebestod. So he said the lover is going to die. Hamlet is going to die, and he's seeing himself as dead and thinking of the fragility of life. Remember, he began the play to be or not to be, that's the question. And now he's getting towards that point where he will not be. Right? So this is moving toward, and of course he's the lover, and his lover's dead, and that's why he's at the graveyard scene. His lover is dead, and the first unequivocal declaration of his love, his struggle with the Laertes and the sealing of his own fate, and the sudden sobering of his own mood that marks the transition to the final scene, all take shape around a leap into and return from the grave that is so weirdly yawned upon, open on the stage. At each stage of understanding this scene, we are dependent on a certain kind of scholarly organization. We need first an editor to clean up the text for us, then the rhetorician and philologist, the editor. So there are different types of criticism. So we need the editor first. Then we need the rhetorician and the philologist, then the literary psychologist. We cannot study the genre without the help of the literary social historian, the literary philosopher, and the student of the history of ideas. And for the archetype, we need a literary anthropologist. But now that we have got our central pattern of criticism established, all these interests are seen as converging on literary criticism instead of receding from it into psychology and history and the rest. So all of these various things, which are all necessary, they converge upon it rather than making literature an empty set and all you need is psychology and history and philosophy and whatever. So it has its own essential features. In particular, the literary anthropologist who chases the source of the Hamlet legend from the pre-Shakespeare play to Saxo Grammaticus, and from Saxo to nature myths, is not running away from Shakespeare, he is drawing closer to the archetypal form which Shakespeare recreated. So he's not saying, well, what's Shakespeare's source for this? Well, there's the stories in Saxo Grammaticus, there's Hamlet. Right? When I taught the play last semester, I talked about that. But if you wanted to go down even further back and more deep in terms of his source is actually the natural world and the idea of the season of fall, part of primal human experience of the seasons. Things live, they die. This is the season of death. And tragedies coincide with that. The Christian element is that it will bring about a restoration of order. In the end, the bad guys will be punished. There's a divine justice in it. There will, right? And a restoration of true order in the kingdom of Denmark, which had been disrupted by Hamlet's father-in-law. A minor result of our new perspective, and I'll conclude with this, is that contradictions among critics and assertions that this and not that critical approach is the right one show a remarkable tendency to dissolve into unreality. Let us now see what we can get from the deductive end. So he is hereby criticizing the critics. So and I'll take it to Eagleton since he's the organizing book around which this semester is. Eagleton is a reductionist because he reduces everything to material causes. And he wants to get rid of this empty set called literature. So there is no such thing as literature. it shows that he is living in unreality. So this is not literary criticism at all anymore. This is just blind ideology. I think that's an unkind way of putting it. I'm sure that Northrop Frye would put it in a more genteel way, but probably dissolving into unreality rather than being a blind ideologue. But then he talks, and I'm not going to get into this here, but then he talks about what I just said, about the four seasons. So the spring, the dawn, the birth phase, the hero, the revival and resurrection, the creation, the father and the mother, the archetype of romance, etc., and then different types of literature. So he divides those up 1, 2, 3, 4, right, on page 1311 and 1312. Those are the archetypal criticisms. So he's not saying that these other things are not criticism. Again, neoclassical criticism was primarily rhetorical. Frye is primarily talking about this as the distinctive literary approach. And he's not saying that this, actually saying all four are distinctive literary approaches, and you need all four. But this is the one that has least been observed, and it's what he calls a literary archaeology. And that's interesting, and we've heard nothing like it, and I think it's worthy contribution to the 20th century discussion of literary theory. And again, it's fallen out of fashion in the academy. There aren't many disciples of Northrop Frye anymore, but there probably ought to be, because at least he's saying something interesting and is trying to say something truthful and general and non-partisan per se. But anyway, I'll leave it off at that.